What if the deepest kind of freedom isn't about having no limits, but about choosing the right ones? And what if that idea came from a man who saw the absolute worst of humanity, from the battlefields of World War II to the gates of Auschwitz and even a death row cell? We're going to explore the incredible life and ideas of Father Franciszek Blachnicki, a man whose brutal journey led him to a powerful and honestly a counterintuitive vision of what it really means to be free.
Okay, let's just start with this quote, because it gets right to the heart of everything. This was the moral crisis Blachnicki saw in Auschwitz. The raw instinct to just survive, it stripped people of their humanity. It turned compassion into a weakness, and it forced him to ask this absolutely terrifying question. If staying alive is all that matters, where does goodness even fit in? This moral abyss, it became the starting point for his entire life's work.
I mean, look at this timeline. Before he was even 21 years old, Blachnicki's life was just one catastrophe after another. In 1939, he's a soldier, fighting a hopeless battle against the Nazi invasion. A year later, he's a political prisoner in Auschwitz, prisoner number 1201. And just 2 years after that, he's sitting in a cell, sentenced to death. Each one of these events is a life-shattering trauma, and it all happened to one person, and it forged the man he was about to become.
So how in the world do you get from a Nazi death row cell to a revolutionary idea of freedom? Well, that's the journey we're going on. We'll start with the priest forged in fire, then look at his unbelievable death row conversion. From there, we'll dive into how he completely redefined liberation, see how he put those ideas into action, and finally, figure out what his message of the freedom within really means for us today.
Okay, so first up, Blachnicki's early years. You know, this wasn't some story of a super pious kid who was always destined for the priesthood. Not at all. It was the story of a young idealist whose entire worldview was about to be systematically crushed by the reality of war.
As a teenager, Blachnicki had actually walked away from his faith. He was all about social ideals, self-improvement, the kind of community he found in the Scouts. He even said later that God just wasn't necessary for his plans. So when the war started, he funneled all that idealism into the Polish resistance, even founded an underground group. But that kind of courage had a price. In April 1940, the Gestapo arrested him.
14 months. Think about that. That's how long he spent inside Auschwitz. And this wasn't just being a prisoner. It was basically a death sentence. They sent him to the brutal penal company, where almost no one survived. They threw him in a starvation bunker. The fact that he made it out alive at all is nothing short of a miracle.
So, after surviving the absolute hell of the camp, Blachnicki then faced his most direct threat yet. This next part of his life, this is where the single most important event happens. It's the moment that gave all that suffering a purpose and his future a completely new direction.
So on March 30th, 1942, a Nazi court sentenced him to death by beheading. And while he's waiting for his execution, stripped of literally everything, facing the absolute end, something incredible happened. He had this sudden, dramatic, life-altering conversion, returning to the faith he'd abandoned years before. Right there, in that moment of total powerlessness, he found a new kind of strength that would define everything he did from that day on.
And then, what can you even call it but a second miracle? His death sentence was commuted just a few months later. He spent the rest of the war in different prisons until he was finally liberated in 1945. Having stared death right in the face and somehow survived, he came out of the war a completely different man. He went straight to the seminary, determined to understand the meaning of this freedom he had found in the most unfree place on earth.
So, how did Blachnicki take all of this pain and suffering and turn it into a philosophy? This is where it gets really interesting. This is where all his experiences come together into a pretty unique theology. He knew that real liberation wasn't just about changing things on the outside. He was convinced the most important battlefield was inside the human heart.
Now, to really get what Blachnicki was saying, it helps to compare it to the more famous Latin American liberation theology. While that movement was all about overthrowing external systems, political or economic structures, Blachnicki argued that the real root of oppression was internal. For him, the true enemy wasn't a political party or an economic system, it was the fear living inside every single one of us.
He laid out his ideas in these 5 core theses. But this wasn't just some academic paper. This whole framework was his direct answer to the slavery he had witnessed firsthand, first in Auschwitz and then under communism. You could almost call it his roadmap from internal slavery to real, genuine liberation.
Okay, so this first point is absolutely crucial. It basically flips our modern idea of freedom completely upside down. He said that the common view, freedom from rules, from limits, from truth, is actually a kind of slavery to our own impulses. True freedom, he argued, is freedom in truth. It's the voluntary, conscious choice to bind yourself to what is good and true, to listen to your conscience, and to take responsibility.
And the ultimate expression of this freedom in truth is this concept he called agape, which basically means self-giving love. It's this beautiful paradox. You only fully possess yourself in the very act of giving yourself away to others. For Blachnicki, real freedom isn't about holding on tighter. It's about having the strength to make a complete gift of yourself. That's when you become the most free. And this connects right back to his experience with totalitarianism. He saw that regimes like Nazism or communism don't just control you with walls and guards, they control you with psychological fear. They make you afraid to speak the truth, afraid to stand up for your neighbor, afraid to be a good person. For Blachnicki, the ultimate act of liberation wasn't some political revolt, but the internal decision to conquer that fear through faith.
Now, Blachnicki wasn't just a thinker, he was a builder. He believed his theology of liberation wasn't something you just read about. It had to be lived. So he took his ideas and channeled them into creating these really powerful social movements that actually changed the face of Poland.
He founded the Life movement, which became this huge force for spiritual renewal for young people living under communism. He started the Crusade for the Liberation of Man, which framed sobriety not just as a personal health choice, but as a patriotic act of liberating the nation from the slavery of alcoholism. And even when he was forced into exile, he set up an international organization to promote his vision of liberation. His ideas had real-world impact.
So, after all that, what does Blachnicki's incredible life really mean for us? Well, it all boils down to one powerful idea, an idea that's just as relevant today as it was in a concentration camp.
Here it is. This is the whole thing in a nutshell. For Blachnicki, the state of your soul and the state of your country were two completely different things. You could be behind the barbed wire of Auschwitz like he was, but remain internally free by choosing to love, to sacrifice, to hold on to what's true. On the flip side, you could live in a free democracy with all the external liberty in the world, but be completely enslaved on the inside by fear, by addiction, by greed, by your own ego. Blachnicki's entire life really just points to one final challenging question for all of us. He proved that there is a kind of freedom that can survive literally anything. So it forces us to ask, what are we enslaved to? And what would it take for us to find that freedom, the kind that no one can ever touch?